All Quiet on the Western Front is a literary masterpiece with the honorary distinction of being the single most realistic piece of World War I fiction, as well as one of the most realistic portrayals of infantry combat ever written. This story deeply resonates with readers nearly a century after publication and over a century after the events described. One of the reasons is because of its raw honesty and authenticity. The author, Erich Maria Remarque, was an infantry soldier wounded several times on the Western Front. He pulled no punches when describing the nightmare fuel that was life and death in the trenches. This masterpiece novel was adapted into film 3 times. Universal Pictures made it for cinema in 1930. The BBC made a 3-hour TV movie in 1979. And the newest version was made for streaming on Netflix in 2022. Each version is unique and retells a story in its own powerful way. This essay doesn't seek to decide which version is best, since they're all so different from each other and they're all good in their own way. Instead, this essay compares the 3 films event by event to see how true they are to the source material. There are spoilers ahead, so be warned, but this essay was really made for folks who have seen all 3 films, or who have at least read the book and know what happens. I'd like to give a quick shout out to Cinemassacre, whose comparison of the Dracula movies to the book inspired me to make this video essay. To be able to find out which version follows the book most closely, I've identified 35 key events, themes, and details that appear in the novel, and together we'll count the number of items shown in each film version. If a movie version was true to the book on something, it gets 1 point. If the item is missing from the movie, it's a 0. And if the movie was kind of true to a detail, where the movie is similar and you can see the book's obvious footprints in that scene, but it was still changed enough to be something new, then it gets half a point. Without commenting on the quality of the film versions, only the fidelity of their content, the number closest to 35 gets the distinction of being the closest to the book. The book starts off with the words, "This is neither an accusation nor a confession," and it goes on to tell about how a generation of young men was destroyed by the war. This does appear in the 1930 film as a title card. It also appears in the 1979 film as a title card and with narration. It does not appear in the Netflix version. Next, we have Cantorec's patriotic speech to his high school students motivating them to enlist. This is portrayed quite faithfully in the 1930 film. It's also portrayed quite faithfully in the 1979 TV movie. The speech and character are portrayed more or less faithfully in the 2022 version, although the situation is slightly changed to where it's the principal speaking to the entire senior class, not just the teacher talking in one classroom. Another detail which sparks off its own subplot in the novel is Corporal Himmelstas's cruelty towards the recruits. This is portrayed in both the 1930 and 1979 versions, but it's not in the 2022 version. You sort of see some of the officers and NCOs at the front line picking on Paul especially, but it's not close enough to what you see in the book for me to give that even half a point. One detail we see in the book, Dettering having a nervous breakdown over the sounds of screaming, dying horses. This is not portrayed in the 1930 version or the 2022 version, but you do see it in the 1979 version. One big character building detail is Kaczynski foraging for food. We see this in all 3 versions. Another event, the Green Soldiers having mental breakdowns in the bunker after they've been getting bombed for several days. We see this in all 3 film versions. Kemmerich getting wounded in combat and eventually dying. We see this in the 1930 version and the 1979 version, and we sort of see it in the 2022 version. Although this version erased the character of Kemmerich and replaced him with Paul's classmate Ludwig, who dies in the artillery barrage, so that one gets half a point. One detail and tiny subplot in the book is the curse of Kemmerich's boots, where every man who wears them is either killed or wounded. We see this in the 1930 version as Muller gets hit, and then we see a sequence where multiple different soldiers are wearing the boots and then all of them get killed. We also see this in the 1979 version, although it's spaced out over different scenes over the course of the film. We sort of see this in the 2022 version, although they changed that detail from Kemmerich's boots to the French girl's scarf, where every man who wears it ends up getting killed. The soldiers relaxing on rear guard duty and having deep conversations about life. We see this in the 1930 version and the 1979 version, and both of those are very faithful to the way it's described in the book. We also see this in the 2022 version, but in slightly different ways. First, we see Paul and Kat shooting the breeze while they're in camp and using the latrine. And then we see soldiers eating and feasting and having a grand old time and joking and just enjoying life after Kat brings food that he and Paul foraged. That one's close enough that I'm going to give it the full point. Another detail, the company's cook prepared food for 150 men, but only 80 men are still alive after yesterday's battle, and the cook doesn't want to dole out the full rations. We see this in all three movies. Although in the 2022 version, it's more of a passing detail to illustrate the greater chaos of the last day of the war. One poignant detail from the book: naked, mutilated corpses in trees that got blown out of their uniforms and into the trees by mortar fire. We do not see this in the 1930 version or the 1979 version, but we do see this in the 2022 film. Another classic All Quiet on the Western Front scene: the date with the French girls. This is recreated very faithfully in the 1930 and 1979 versions. The 2022 version gets half a point since Paul doesn't go on the date and it's just one soldier that goes off to join the girls by himself. Corporal Himmelstoss arriving at the front line. This is in the 1930 and 1979 versions, but there is no Corporal Himmelstoss in the 2022 version. Himmelstoss getting a medal that he doesn't deserve. This is absent from the 1930 version. It is included in the 1979 version. And once again, there is no Himmelstoss in the 2022 version. The soldiers see the big stacks of coffins before the battle and they get all bummed out. This is in the 1930 and 1979 versions, but absent from the 2022 version. Paul getting wounded. He gets wounded by artillery fire in the 1930 and 1979 versions. We do not see him wounded in the 2022 version, and his death scene does not count. Albert attempts suicide in the hospital. In the 1930 version, it's Muller that ends up in the hospital. However, this is faithfully recreated in the 1979 version. The 2022 version gets half a point, since it's not Albert that attempts suicide in the hospital, it's Chadin who successfully commits suicide in the hospital, but there's enough similarity that it at least gets the half point. Paul goes home on leave and finds it utterly depressing. We see this in the 1930 version and the 1979 version. Paul does not go home on leave in the 2022 version. Paul visits Mrs. Kemmerich. This is absent from the 1930 version, but it is recreated in the 1979 version. The character Kemmerich was not written into the 2022 version. Paul confronts Kantorek for brainwashing his students. This is recreated in the 1930 and the 1979 versions, but Paul does not go home on leave in the 2022 version. Datering tries to desert and most likely ends up dead. This is mentioned in the 1930 version with enough detail to get the point. It's mentioned in the 1979 version along with a visual of Datering just walking off on his own. But this scene is absent from the 2022 film. One detail that you see a lot in the novel: soldiers dead from gas. It's not shown in the 1930 version, but it is mentioned quite a bit, including descriptions of other soldiers from their own regiment who were killed by gas in large numbers. In the 1979 version, we see soldiers coughing as they slowly die from the gas. And in the Netflix version, you see an entire warehouse room full of dead soldiers who were gassed while they were in the warehouse. A classic staple scene from this narrative: Paul stabs a French soldier who dies a slow, agonizing death. This is quite faithfully represented in all three versions. One detail from the novel: the soldiers, who haven't actually seen a woman in the longest time, stop to stare at and admire a poster of a woman that seems to be an advertisement for a fashion magazine. In the 1930 and 1979 versions, you see Paul and Kropp admiring the woman on the poster, which is hung up in a bar, Whereas in the Netflix version, Kropp finds it in the abandoned industrial complex and then rips off the half of the poster with the woman on it and takes it with him. Another classic scene from the novel, the battle in the cemetery, where Paul finds himself face to face with corpses that have been blown out of their graves. We see this in the 1930 and 1979 versions, but it's absent from the 2022 version. One detail we read about in the novel is that the Germans in this story don't only fight Frenchmen, they also specifically fight Englishmen towards the end of the book. Surprisingly, this detail is absent from all 3 film versions. Details also mentioned in the novel include tanks, planes, and flamethrowers. We sort of see this in the 1930 version, as we see soldiers behind the lines getting bombed from an airplane. In the 1979 version, we see planes flying over the battlefield and we see people being killed by flamethrowers, but there are no tanks. In the Netflix version, there are tanks, there are planes flying over the battlefield, and there are people being annihilated by flamethrowers. The tank scene was especially impressive and terrifying. Another little plot twist from the novel. Cantorek gets drafted, and one of the former students whom he brainwashed into enlisting in the army is now the commanding officer, dropping him for push-ups. This scene is also missing from all 3 film versions, which is a bummer because it's a really good scene. Paul counts the dead from their high school class. We see this in the 1930 version in the form of a conversation with Kat and some of the other soldiers. And we see this in the 1979 version in the form of Paul's narration as he writes a letter to Albert, but it's absent from the 2022 version. Chaden and Hyavesthus getting killed. We see this in the 1930 version and the 1979 version. We sort of see this in the 2022 version, since Chaden kills himself in the hospital after getting wounded on the battlefield. But the character Hyavesthus was not written into the Netflix version. Rumors of the oncoming armistice destroying soldiers' morale and discipline as they keep getting sent back to the battlefield. This is absent from the 1930 version, but it is represented in the 1979 and 2022 versions. Mentions of the US joining the war. We don't get any of this in the 1930 version, probably because it was too soon for American audiences after the war. But in the 1979 version, Kat mentions that the Americans are in the war and dogpiling on the Germans now. While in the 2022 version, Matthias mentions that 250,000 Americans are landing in France every month. Kaczynski's death. Kat's death is shown in all 3 film versions, although each one does it differently. In the 1930 version, Kat is killed by a bomb dropped by an airplane while he's out foraging for food. In the 1979 version, he's killed by shrapnel from an artillery strike behind the lines while he's out foraging for food. In the 2022 version, he gets shot to death by the young son of the farmer whom he and Paul have been robbing throughout the movie. But in all 3 versions, Kat is dead at the moment when Paul brings him into the aid station. Paul mentoring the young soldiers the way Kat used to mentor him when he was new. In the 1930 film, we see Paul in the bunker with soldiers who are several years younger than him. In the 1979 film, we see Paul in the trenches making sure that each one of the young soldiers is still awake at his post. In the 2022 version, we see Paul correcting and instructing the new recruits on their way to the trenches for battle. Finally, the 35th item from the book, Paul dies before the armistice. We see this in the 1930 film, although it doesn't give a date for Paul's death. We just know from the soldiers' dialogue that both the army and the whole country have gone to hell, that it's probably late in 1918. We also see Paul killed before the armistice in the 1979 version, although this version dates his death at October of 1918. The Netflix version gets half a point because Paul gets stabbed moments before the armistice takes effect, but he dies moments after the war officially ends. In the book, Paul dies 1 week before the armistice, so November 4th. So let's look at our totals to see which film version is the closest to the book. With a score of 17 out of 35, the film adaptation that diverges the most from the source material is the 2022 version from Netflix. Just over half of the events, themes, and details on the list are absent from the newest version, and much of the movie is new content injected into a narrative based on Remarque's book. This film actually combines 3 different stories into one new one. One main subplot is the real story of Matthias Erzberger's trip to France to sign the armistice. Another main subplot is the story of the fictional General Friedrichs, an armchair general hungry for glory, and who orders the final charge 15 minutes before the war ends. Which was a waste, by the way, because the treaty stipulated that the Germans were going to give up whatever territory they took anyway. The third main subplot is the story of Remarque's character, Paul Baumer, his classmates and army buddies, who are directly affected by the actions of both the diplomats and the generals. There are 2 big things I give this version credit for. First, it's refreshing to see a story about Germans finally told in German, although it's also available dubbed in English. Second, this version has the most realistic combat scenes and battle deaths, including gore. This is partly due to technological capabilities not available to past generations of filmmakers. It's also due to the lighter self-censorship in the film industry today, where movies can be rated R, versus the stricter censorship boards that movies had to pass in the 1930s. Although Paul Baumer is the main character, this version is not a movie about Paul Baumer. It's a movie about the armistice, and how it affected Paul Baumer. Moving on. With a score of 25.5 out of 35, the 1930 theatrical version is much closer to the book than the Netflix version. This movie is going on 93 years old as I record this, but it still packs a powerful gut punch. I watched it for the first time in high school over 15 years ago, and then I watched it again recently to compare it to the other versions, and I was honestly speechless at the end. It was that powerful. This movie is a product of its time in several ways that are good and others that are not so good. It's awkward at first hearing American accents and slang from the 1920s telling a story about Germans, but the cinematography is so exquisite that it makes you want to keep watching anyway. The technological constraints of 1929 didn't permit realistic gore, and the newness of movies with sound, called talkies, left much to be desired with the audio quality. Nonetheless, I was surprised at how well the battle scenes were done. I was also surprised at the amount of blood still in this movie, the overall intensity of the violence, and the sharp cinematography that used motion to help convey both the chaos and magnitude of battle. All of this is considering how conservative most movies were back in that time. This is nothing like the squeaky clean World War II movies that Hollywood churned out for 3 decades. The acting is excellent, and the dialogue is potent, regardless of the dated slang. Every single actor was great, especially Lou Ayres as Paul Baumer, Louis Walheim as Kat, and Slim Somerville as Chadin. This is a movie where these 3 comedy actors proved that they were heavyweights in dramatic acting. Scenes like Kat and Chadin getting drunk are genuinely funny, and scenes like Kat's death, or Chadin coming back with nothing to eat, are genuinely gut-wrenching. The 1930 version of All Quiet on the Western Front definitely earned its Academy Awards for Best Picture and Best Director. Now, the moment you've been waiting for. With a score of 31.5 out of 35, the 1979 TV adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front is the film version that's most faithful to the novel. This version follows the book closely in its narrative style, narrating with Paul Baumer's voice, and showing major plot elements out of chronological order. It even puts Paul in the high school class of 1916, just like the novel's author. While the flashbacks and time jumps work in the book, I'm not a big fan of TV movies following the Quentin Tarantino approach of not being stuck to linear time, like the aliens from Slaughterhouse-5. The soundtrack is sufficiently gloomy and at times grim, but it leaves much to be desired. Another drawback is the censorship constraints for British TV movies, which is why this movie has a lot of violence but not a lot of blood. It's actually pretty clean, very comparable to Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. All that aside, I really like the performances from some of the actors, mainly Richard Thomas as Paul, Ernest Borgnine, who was outstanding as Kat, Michael Myers as psychologist as Cantorek, and Bilbo Baggins as Himmelstas. Very few details from the book are changed in this movie. It's only really just a few omissions, probably made for time, budget, and pacing, that kept this film from hitting 35 out of 35. Still, this version is true to 90% of the items on the list. And that is how the 3 film adaptations of All Quiet on the Western Front compare to the source material. Thank you for watching this video essay. If you're interested in other fascinating documentaries on different wars in modern history, check out The Confederate Territory of Arizona on my channel, The Civil War Wild West Edition. If you want content on present-day modern wars, check out the miniseries on factions in the Venezuelan Civil War on my other channel, Venezuela Explained. Take care, and always remember the armistice.